What is the exact price of a human soul? Most people think it's a philosophical question, something reserved for poets or priests in the safety of a sanctuary. But for Amara Bennett, the price was the cold weight of a signature on a contract and a diamond that felt less like jewelry and more like a platinum shackle. 6 months ago, Amara was a woman defined by the quiet order of her life, the rhythmic clicking of her keyboard, the scent of oil paints in her small apartment, and the soft, natural curls she spent too much time worrying about. She was a good girl, a person who lived in the light because she never imagined the shadows would notice her. But the thing about the light is that it doesn't just illuminate, it exposes. The shadow that finally noticed her had a name, Park Min-yi. He wasn't just her boss's best friend. He was a predator who moved through the corporate world with a lethal, bored elegance. He carried a handgun on marble tables as casually as a fountain pen, and his tattoos climbed his neck like dark ivy, a warning to anyone foolish enough to look too closely. He was the king of a Korean syndicate, a man who didn't just walk into a room, he took possession of it. When Amara's brother gambled away a future that didn't belong to him to the ruthless Falcone family, Min-yi stepped out of the darkness with an offer that was both a lifeline and a total surrender. A beautiful, elaborate, and deadly lie. She would become his fake fiancée. She would be the touch of gentle normality he needed to mask a bloody transition of power. But as Amara stood on the edge of the abyss, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. She wasn't just afraid of the fall. She was starting to wonder what it felt like to finally hit the bottom. Before we proceed, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comment and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here so you don't miss out on what is ahead. Now let's dive into the story. The golden glow of the office elevators felt like a fatting dream the moment Amara stepped out into the damp, biting air of the November evening. The city didn't feel like a home tonight. It felt like an enemy, the cold mist clinging to her skin like a damp shroud. Usually, the walk to the train was a time for her to decompress, her mind drifting to the simple comforts of her apartment and the oil paints waiting for her on the easel. She lived for that quiet order, the predictable rhythm of a life where the most dangerous thing she faced was a looming deadline. But tonight, the air felt thick, too heavy for her lungs, as if the atmospheric pressure had dropped in anticipation of a storm she couldn't yet see. Her breath came in short, shallow puffs of white vapor. She took the shortcut through the narrow alley behind the chemistry department, a path she had navigated 100 times without a second thought. It was a corridor of brick and shadow, a mundane slice of the city that usually offered nothing but a faster route home. Halfway down the alley, her feet suddenly felt nailed to the damp concrete. Her heart, which had been beating at a calm pace, suddenly bolted into a frantic drum against her ribs. 2 men emerged from the fog ahead, blocking the exit with an arrogant, predatory confidence. They didn't just appear. They had been waiting, their broad shoulders filling the narrow space like a physical wall of muscle and malice. The smell hit her first, a sour, aggressive mix of cheap cigarettes and dirty rain that seemed to stain the very air she breathed. It was the scent of a life she had only ever seen in the news, a grimy reality that was now inches from her face. Before she could even process the logic of retreat, she heard a movement behind her. A 3rd man had circled around, sealing her escape route and leaving her trapped in a pocket of darkness. "Amara Bennett," a voice rasped, sounding like gravel being ground into the pavement. The big man in front took a step closer, his gaze traveling down her body with a slow, appraising look that made her feel naked and violated by the stare alone. He didn't look at her like a person. He looked at her like a ledger to be balanced. "No need to be scared, sweetheart," he said, though the smile on his lips was the jagged expression of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "We're just here to deliver a message about your brother." The word hit her with the force of a physical punch. Amara knew her brother, Marcus, had a penchant for small bets, but hearing his name in this context shattered her world. The man reached out, and for a terrifying second she thought he would strike her. She flinched, her eyes squeezed shut, bracing for a pain that didn't come. Instead, he just brushed the tip of his finger against a voluminous, natural curl that had escaped her ponytail. The gesture was intimate and degrading, stripping her of every defense she possessed. It was a claim of ownership before the deal had even been made. "Your brother made some expensive friends, and patience has run out," the man whispered, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee against her cheek. He has 1 week to pay what he owes, or we'll start collecting in other ways. His eyes lingered on her with a silent, terrifying implication. The collection would be her. As quickly as they had materialized, the shadows retreated, leaving Amara alone in the middle of the alley with her body shaking uncontrollably. She leaned against the cold, damp brick to keep from falling, the belief that her small world of warmth and softness could keep her safe dissolving into a childish illusion. The sanctuary of her life had been violated, and the darkness she had only sensed at the edges of the city had finally touched her. She walked the rest of the way home in a stiff, automatic trance, but the streetlights brought no comfort. Every stranger was now a potential enemy, every shadow a hidden threat. When she reached her building and slid down the back of her locked door, the tears finally came, not for the money, but for the loss of her innocence. She realized with a cold, terrible certainty that the police couldn't protect her family from men like this. Monsters could only be fought by other monsters, and her mind kept returning to the one man who commanded the darkness, Park Min-yi. The heavy deadbolt on Amara's apartment door felt like a paper shield against the storm she had just invited into her life. She spent the entire night packing the small perimeter of her living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she could hold her shattering world together by sheer force of will. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren wailing through the city streets, made her heart leap into her throat, a physical bruising reminder that the Falcon's clock was already ticking. By dawn, the pragmatic, desperate part of her mind had overruled her terror. She knew her boss, Adrian, was a good man, but he was a creature of the light. He dealt in contracts and handshakes, not in blood and shadows. He couldn't fight a war where the rules didn't exist. There was only one person who lived in that darkness and commanded it, a man whose name felt like both a lifeline and a total surrender of her soul, Park Min-yi. The next evening, Amara didn't wait for the shadows to find her. She waited outside the entrance of an upscale, dimly lit lounge where she knew Min-yi frequently met with his inner circle. She kept her hands buried deep in the pockets of her wool coat, clenching them into fists to hide the uncontrollable trembling of her fingers. When a long, black sedan, a predator of polished metal and tinted glass, pulled toward the curb, the very air seemed to bend and thicken around its presence. Min-yi stepped out, but he wasn't the polished, distant executive she occasionally glimpsed in the office hallways. Dressed in a black turtleneck that accentuated the lethal breadth of his shoulders and the sharp, dangerous angles of his frame, he looked stripped of any pretense of civility. He didn't acknowledge her at first. He stood on the sidewalk, the smoke from his breath dissipating into the freezing night air, waiting with the unhurried, agonizing patience of a man who already knew he had won. It was a test, a silent, arrogant demand that she be the one to bridge the distance and vocalize her own defeat. Every step Amara took toward him felt like an echo of her own surrender. "Get in the car, Amara," he finally said. His voice was low and resonant, a vibration that she felt directly in her bones rather than her ears. It wasn't a request. It was a cold, clinical order that left no room for rebellion. Inside the car, the world was muffled by thick, soundproof glass and the oppressive, expensive scent of leather and a sharp, masculine cologne. Min-yi turned in his seat, his sharp jawline silhouetted by the passing streetlights, his dark eyes studying her with a frightening, predatory intelligence that seemed to see right through the fragile mask of calm she was trying to project. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. "Every detail." Amara's voice shook, cracking more than once as she described the encounter in the alley, the mention of the Falcons, and the degrading way the man had touched her hair. As she spoke, she noticed a single vein pulse at Min-yi's temple. His knuckles turned white where they gripped the steering wheel, and though his face remained a mask of unreadable granite, the air in the car grew heavy with a sudden, suffocating tension. "I'll handle it," he said once she finished, his voice frigid enough to frost the glass. "The debt will be forgiven, your brother will be safe." The relief was so sudden it made her dizzy, but Amara wasn't a fool. She knew that men like Min-yi didn't do favors out of the goodness of their hearts, they made transactions. "What do you want in return?" she asked, lifting her chin to meet his gaze, trying to find a spark of humanity in the dark voids of his eyes. Min-yi leaned forward, pinning her in place with his sheer physical presence. "You." The word hung in the air like a final sentence. Seeing the flash of pure panic in her eyes, he clarified with a hint of dry irritation. "Not in that way. At least, not primarily. He explained his position with the clinical distance of a businessman discussing a merger. He had recently taken over the leadership of the syndicate and needed to project an image of stability and tradition to keep his rivals from testing his new boundaries. "I need a fiancé," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "For 6 months, you will live in my house under my protection. You will wear my ring and attend events by my side. You will be the picture of respectability, the good girl who tamed the beast. In exchange, your brother becomes untouchable. No one will lay a finger on him while you are mine." It was a gilded cage, a total surrender of her identity for the safety of her family. She looked at the dark tattoos peeking from his collar and the quiet, coiled danger in his posture, realizing she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and he was the only one holding the rope. "I accept," she whispered, and the words felt irrevocable, sealing her fate as the car pulled away from the curb and vanished into the darkness of her new life. The drive to Minnie's estate felt like a slow, silent descent into a beautiful, high-tech mausoleum. His home wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of dark glass, reinforced steel, and jagged gray stone perched atop a secluded hill overlooking the city's glowing arteries. There was none of the unruly warmth of the world Amara had known. No peeling wallpaper, no cluttered bookshelves, no smell of old coffee. Everything here was precise, angular, and cold, mirroring the man who owned it. As the heavy iron gates hissed, shut behind the sedan, the sound felt like the final, heavy thud of a prison door. Inside, the foyer swallowed the sound of her footsteps. The floors were a sea of polished black marble that reflected the crystal chandelier above like cold stars in a dead sky. Amara felt small and intrusive, a vibrant spark of messy life in a space that felt designed to intimidate anyone who dared to enter. Minnie led her deeper into the house with an air of clinical detachment, his presence making the vast, open-concept rooms feel suddenly cramped and charged with a restless energy. "Your room is in the east wing," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Before she could respond, an older, reserved woman named Maria appeared from the shadows. She didn't smile. She simply gestured toward a floating staircase of glass and steel. As Amara followed the woman, she could feel Minnie's eyes on her back, a physical weight, a pressure that made her heart stumble rhythmically against her ribs. The guest suite was a masterpiece of impersonal luxury. A king-sized bed with pristine, suffocatingly white sheets sat before a floor-to-ceiling wall of solid glass, offering a breathtaking view of the city lights she had just left behind. There wasn't a single photograph, a stray book, or a piece of art to suggest human life had ever touched this room. It was a 5-star hotel room in a gilded cage, and Amara was the only occupant. "The master dines at 8, Maria informed her before closing the door with a final, soft click that echoed in the silence. Amara spent the remaining hours in the bathroom, a cavern of white marble and expensive, scentless toiletries. She scrubbed her skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the memory of the alley and the lingering sense of being watched. When she stepped back into the bedroom, she found a simple black silk dress laid out on the bed. Beside it sat a note in strong, slanted handwriting that simply read, "For dinner." Descending the stairs at 8, she found Minnie already seated at the head of a mahogany table that could easily seat 20. He had rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms corded with muscle and a web of dark veins that spoke of a restrained, dangerous power. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic clinking of silver against porcelain until he spoke, his voice making her jump. "You have questions," he stated, not as an invitation but as a fact. "How do we explain this?" Amara asked, her voice trembling slightly as she toyed with her food. "An engagement out of nowhere. People aren't stupid, Minnie." Minnie didn't look up from his plate, his jaw set in a hard line of tension. "I will speak with your parents tomorrow," he said with a cold, calculating certainty. "I'll explain that we've been seeing each other secretly for months and that I am a traditional man. Their relief over your brother's safety will make them very receptive to whatever story I tell." The frankness of his manipulation sent a shiver down her spine, but his next words established the true boundaries of her new life. "There are rules, Amara," he said, his voice hardening into a mask of absolute control. "You will not go anywhere without a driver I assign. Your phone will be monitored for your own safety, and you will never, under any circumstances, enter my private office." "I'm not your prisoner," Amara whispered, a final, futile act of rebellion against the invisible bars closing in around her. Minyi's lips curved into a ghost of a smile, a jagged, dark expression that didn't reach his frighteningly intelligent eyes. "Aren't you?" he asked quietly. "You are under my protection, Amara. In my world, that means you are under my control. It is the only way you stay alive." He stood and left the room without a goodbye, leaving her alone in the vast, silent dining room. As she lay in the enormous, foreign bed later that night, Amara realized she had traded one predator for another. She was safe from the Falcons, but she was now trapped with a dragon in his lair, and a terrifying question haunted her sleep. What would happen if, after 6 months, she no longer wanted to be rescued? The farce was set with a cold, glittering precision. A week after Amara had crossed the threshold of the fortress, the first true test of their lie arrived in a blue velvet box. It was a gift from a designer Amara had only ever seen in the glossy pages of magazines she read during hurried lunch breaks at her old life. Inside was a deep silk gown in a shade of sapphire, so rich it looked like liquid midnight, a dress that matched the ring Minyi had forced onto her finger. The ring was a masterpiece of intimidation, a simpler, elegant emerald-cut diamond flanked by 2 deep blue stones. It felt like a heavy platinum chain against her skin, a constant reminder of the debt she was paying. The dress wasn't just a garment, it was a weapon. It featured a plunging neckline and a side slit that climbed dangerously high, intended to arm her for the theater of the elite. Amara stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman in the mirror. The good girl from the administrative office was gone, replaced by a ghost in expensive silk. When Amara descended the floating staircase that evening, she found Minyi waiting in the foyer. He was dressed in a black tuxedo that looked as if it had been stitched directly onto his frame, highlighting the lethal breadth of his shoulders. For a fleeting second, the steel composure he wore like armor seemed to crack. His breath hitched almost inaudibly, and a slow, hungry gaze swept over her body, a look so intense it warmed her and terrified her all at once. It was the first time she saw the man beneath the predator, a man who seemed momentarily blindsided by the very reaction she provoked in him. "You look," he began, his voice a shade huskier than its usual resonant calm, "acceptable." The gala was a sea of rich, powerful faces, the air buzzing with the artificial clinking of champagne glasses and hollow compliments. Amara felt like a fraud, an imposter walking through a world of old money and whispered secrets, until Minyi placed his hand on the small of her back. The possessive gesture, disguised as intimacy, sent a violent electric shock up her spine. The heat of his palm burned through the thin silk of her gown, anchoring her to him in a way that made her head spin. "Relax," he murmured near her ear, his warm breath making her skin tingle in the cool ballroom air. "Just smile and hold my hand. I'll handle the rest." She played her part, laughing at unfunny jokes and accepting empty praises, all while remaining hyper-aware of the strength of his hand holding hers. But the atmosphere shifted the moment a man with silver hair and cold, snake-like eyes watched them from across the room. Ricardo Falcone didn't just watch. He moved toward them with a predatory smile, his gaze lingering on Amara's neckline in a way that made her feel like she needed to scrub her skin. "Minyi, my boy, I heard you were engaged," Falcone said, his voice oily and laden with the tension that lived embedded in their world. "A rare beauty, protect her well. Pretty things tend to break easily." The veiled threat hung in the air like a death sentence. Minyi didn't shout. He simply moved subtly, positioning his body in front of hers and wrapping a heavy arm around her waist to press her against his side. The message was primitive and unmistakable. Mine. Trembling with a rage and fear she couldn't name, Amara whispered that she needed air, and Minyi guided her to a secluded terrace overlooking the dark gardens. The cool night air couldn't quench the heat of the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Did you see the way he looked at me?" she asked, her voice filled with a trembling anger. "I saw," Minyi replied, his voice frigid and dangerous. He turned to her, cornering her against the stone balustrade until they were inches apart. "Do you understand now, Amara? This world is not a game. When you are with me, you are a reflection of me. An affront to you is an affront to me." The intensity in his face made her hold her breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs, echoing with a mixture of terror and an excitement she refused to acknowledge. "I'm just part of a deal," she whispered, a desperate reminder to herself as his eyes dropped to her lips. The world seemed to stop spinning. The sound of the party faded, leaving only the sound of their ragged breaths and the ever-shrinking space between them. He leaned in, his scent of whiskey and starch enveloping her, and for a moment, the carefully drawn line between the lie and the truth was irrevocably blurred. He wanted her, and as she closed her eyes in anticipation, she realized with a terrifying jolt that she wanted him, too. The incident on the terrace had changed the topography of their existence, leaving a charged, heavy silence in the mansion that felt as though it might detonate with one wrong step. Minyi had retreated further into his shell of formal, icy control, yet Amara saw the cracks, the sudden tension in his broad shoulders whenever she entered a room, and the way his dark gaze lingered on her whenever he thought she wasn't looking. The precarious truce was finally broken by a storm that descended upon the city with biblical fury, rain hammering against the dark glass windows like desperate fists, while the wind howled like a wounded animal. Amara sat alone in her room, the sudden, jagged flashes of lightning making her jump as they lit up the sky, reminding her of how chaotic and uncontrollable her world had become. Then, a blinding flash was followed by a clap of thunder so loud it seemed to crack the very foundation of the hill, and the mansion was plunged into a total, terrifying darkness. In the ensuing silence, the familiar, comforting hum of electricity was gone, leaving only the primal roar of the storm outside. Moved by an instinct she didn't fully understand, Amara left her room, guiding herself along the cool, smooth texture of the walls in the pitch-black hallway. "Minyi," she whispered, her voice immediately swallowed by the gloom. She followed a faint, flickering glow to the library, where the fireplace had been lit, casting long, dancing shadows across the endless rows of leather-bound books. Minyi was there, sitting in a deep leather armchair with a glass of whiskey, looking as though he had been expecting her. The firelight softened the hard, lethal lines of his face, making him look younger and revealing a profound weariness in his eyes she had never seen before. "I don't like the dark," she confessed, the words sounding small and fragile against the roar of the wind. "No one does," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He gestured for her to sit in the armchair opposite his. For a while, they sat in a comfortable, heavy silence, the warmth of the fire thawing the chill that had settled in her bones. Amara spoke to fill the quiet, telling him how her father used to say thunder was the sound of a dragon roaring in the mountains. In return, Minyi offered a rare, precious piece of himself, a memory of his mother singing lullabies to drown out the literal and metaphorical storms of his youth. He spoke of how the light had left the house when she died, forcing him to grow up in a single night and learn to be the strong one for everyone else. The confession hung between them, fragile and precious. Amara didn't see the ruthless Mafia boss in that moment. She saw the boy who had to become a man too soon, a man who had built a fortress around his heart to keep the world out. "I see you, Minyi," she whispered, standing up and taking a hesitant, bold step toward him. "I see the man who protects what he loves, the man who sits alone in the dark because he's afraid to let anyone else in." He turned to her, his face a mask of intense conflict as he warned her that she was playing with fire. "You don't know what you're asking for, Amara. I am not a good man." "Maybe I want to get burned," she challenged, lifting her chin as the air between them crackled with years of repressed desire and a sudden, shocking understanding. Minyi's fortress of control finally shattered. He closed the distance in a single, predatory stride, his hand fisting in her curls at the nape of her neck, while the other pulled her flush against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. "Amara," he murmured, his voice a prayer and a curse before he kissed her. It was a collision of years of pent-up tension, a hungry and demanding claim that left her breathless. He tasted of whiskey and fire, and as she clung to his shoulders, she kissed him back with a desperate hunger of her own, pouring all her secret fascination and fear into the surrender. In that library, while the thunder roared outside, the sounds she heard were not of a dragon, but of the walls between them finally crumbling to dust. The fragile peace that had settled over the mansion following the storm was a glass floor, beautiful, transparent, but destined to crack under the slightest weight. For Amara and Minyi, the morning after the library was a blur of avoided eye contact and a heavy, electric awareness that made the very air in the breakfast nook feel thick and difficult to swallow. The physical surrender had changed the gravity of their arrangement, turning a business transaction into something far more volatile. But the world outside the iron gates did not care about the shifting tides of their hearts. It was a world built on debt, and it had come to collect. The collision happened on a gray, silent Tuesday afternoon. Adrian Whitmore, a man whose life was defined by the bright, predictable lights of the corporate office and the safety of spreadsheets, did not belong in Minyi's foyer. Yet there he stood, his face a mask of pale fury and deep, aching disappointment. He held a folder of documents, records of the fake engagement, and the shipping debts that Minyi had erased to keep Amara's family safe. The gears of the dangerous machine Amara had set in motion were now turning against the people she loved most. Amara stood at the top of the floating staircase, her hand gripping the cold marble railing so hard her knuckles turned white. Below, Adrian was shouting, his voice echoing off the black marble floors like a physical blow. "I trusted you with her, Minyi." Adrian's voice cracked with a betrayal that was sharper than any blade. "I told you to look out for her because I thought you were the one person who could truly protect her from the Falcons, and instead, you've dragged her into this filth behind my back." Minyi didn't shout back. He stood like a monolith of shadow, his presence lengthening across the floor as he rose to his feet. He moved instinctively, stepping toward the stairs to block Adrian's line of sight to Amara. A silent guardian even in the face of a truth he could no longer hide. The secret was out, and the air in the foyer suddenly felt too heavy for her lungs, charged with a tension that threatened to dismantle the only safety she had ever known. Amara finally stepped into the light, her voice a mere thread of sound as she called Adrian's name. When he looked up at her, the expression on his face made her stomach heave. It wasn't just anger. It was the look of a man who realized the person he had protected was a stranger. "Is it true, Amara?" Adrian asked, his voice dropping to a jagged, broken whisper. "Is this whole thing, this relationship, this engagement, just a transaction? How long have you been playing this part?" The truth was a lead weight in her throat. To admit she had sold herself, even for a noble cause, felt like a confession of a crime. She looked at Minyi, whose jaw was set in a line of granite, his eyes pleading with her to stay silent, and then back to Adrian. She realized that revealing the full extent of the farce would only deepen the betrayal. She remained silent, a choice that proved to be the wrong answer. "So that's it," Adrian said, shaking his head slowly, his eyes filled with a cold resignation. "You're together, you chose this." The hurt in his eyes hardened into a wall. He turned toward the heavy oak door, his shoulders slumped under a weight he wasn't built to carry. The door slammed with a finality that echoed in Amara's heart, leaving her standing on the stairs while tears finally broke through the mask she had worn so carefully. She had fixed one problem only to create a monster-sized one, and the ache of Adrian's absence now haunted the mansion like a ghost. Minyi turned to her, his face a grim mask of controlled fury, yet he let his hand fall when he reached out to comfort her. The storm outside had passed, but the one they had created within these walls was only just beginning. The days following the confrontation with Adrian were gray and silent, as the ache of his absence became a constant, physical presence in the mansion, a shadow that not even the new, fragile intimacy with Minyi could fully dispel. They moved around each other with a painful care, the raw passion of that stormy night in the library now tempered by the cold, biting reality of its consequences. The world they were building felt incomplete, a flawed masterpiece without the blessing of the one man who had always represented the light in Amara's life. Minyi, sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure of their world, became even more protective, his concern bordering on obsession. He forbade Amara from leaving the house entirely, insisting that the streets were no longer safe, that the air itself had become toxic. "The Falcons are quiet," he would say during their rare, tense dinners, his eyes never leaving the dark wine in his glass. "Too quiet. It's the silence of a predator waiting for the wind to change." The house, which had briefly begun to feel like a sanctuary, felt like a gilded cage once more, and Minyi's constant, brooding worry was a reminder that the original danger hadn't disappeared. It had only changed shape, becoming more refined and more lethal. Amara spent her afternoons in the library, trying unsuccessfully to lose herself in the manuscripts she used to love, but every creak of the floorboards made her heart leap into her throat. The crisis reached its boiling point on a humid Saturday afternoon. Amara was attempting to concentrate on her work when she heard raised, frantic voices coming from the foyer. One was Minyi's low, resonant growl. The other was Adrian's, sharp and filled with a frantic, desperate energy. She ran out of the library and stopped at the top of the stairs, hidden in the deep shadows of the marble balcony. Adrian was standing in the hall, his face pale and etched with an anger that bordered on madness. Minyi stood before him, a silent, immovable sentinel blocking his path into the deeper reaches of the house. "I just want to talk to her, Minyi. You can't keep her locked up in here forever like a trophy," Adrian shouted, his voice echoing in the vast, cold space. "She's not locked up. She's safe," Minyi replied, his voice a flat, lethal contrast to Adrian's heat. "Safe from what? From me," Adrian retorted, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. "I'm the only one who truly knows her, not this role you've forced her into." As they argued, the tension in the room snapped with the intrusive, shrill ring of Minyi's phone. He glanced at the caller ID, and the blood drained from his face until it was a mask of pale granite. He answered, his body stiffening into a posture of absolute, lethal alert. He listened in a heavy, suffocating silence of shock. Amara felt a cold dread creep up her spine like a shard of ice. Minyi hung up the phone and looked at Adrian, and the anger that had defined their confrontation was replaced by something far more terrifying, a cold, controlled fear. "They have her brother," he said, the words falling between them like heavy chips of ice. "The Falcons. They took Marcus from his office 10 minutes ago." Amara's world tilted on its axis. Her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the marble steps, her head spinning as the air seemed to thicken, becoming too heavy for her lungs. Her brother. The Falcons had finally moved from threats to action, and the beautiful and dangerous lie of her safety had been completely dismantled. Minyi was already moving. The lethal calm of a predator taking over, he began barking orders into a second phone in rapid-fire Korean. Men in black suits who seemed to materialize out of the very shadows of the mansion appeared in the hall, a storm of metal and glass coming to life. "Stay with her," Minyi ordered two of the men, pointing toward the stairs where Amara sat paralyzed. "Do not let her leave this house. If she tries to move, stop her." "No," Amara cried, scrambling to her feet and descending the last few steps. "You can't go without me. It's my brother, Minyi. It's my fault." Minyi turned to her, and for a second, his face was an impenetrable mask of conflict and raw agony. He reached out as if to touch her, but his hand stopped inches away. "That's exactly why you're not going," he said, his voice a low, vibrating command that brooked no argument. "You are what they want, Amara. Your brother is just the bait. If I bring you to them, I've already lost." He turned back to Adrian, the previous argument forgotten in the face of the blood-red crisis. "Take her upstairs. Keep her safe. If I don't call in 1 hour, get her out of the city." Minyi turned and strode out the heavy oak door, his men following him like a dark, unstoppable tide. Adrian guided Amara back toward the library, his hands firm on her shoulders, but she could feel the tremor in his grip. They were left in a heavy, agonizing silence, waiting for a phone call that might never come. The silence in the library was no longer a sanctuary. It was a ticking clock that hammered against Amara's ribs with every passing second. Adrian sat in the velvet armchair opposite her, his head buried in his hands, his breathing heavy with a guilt that mirrored her own. But Amara was done with waiting in the shadows of a gilded cage. She was done being the prize that men fought over while her own blood paid the price in a cold, concrete room somewhere in the city. A memory surfaced, unwelcome and sharp, a moment weeks ago when Marcus had returned home in a cold sweat, muttering about shipping records he was holding for a client he shouldn't have named. The Falcons. "Adrian, look at me," she said, her voice filled with a new, frantic urgency that made him lift his head. "I have to go to the office. Marcus wasn't just gambling. He was hiding something. If there is any leverage there, any proof of what the Falcons are really doing, Minyi needs it before he walks into a bullet." Adrian's loyalty to her finally overrode his fear of Minyi's wrath. He saw the fire in her eyes, a reflection of the dragon she had been living with. They orchestrated a desperate escape, distracting the guards by staging an emergency in the kitchen that drew the security detail toward the back of the estate. It was a clumsy, heart-pounding maneuver, but it allowed Amara and Adrian to slip through the side gardens and into his modest car, disappearing into the biting night air. The drive to Marcus's office was a blur of neon lights and adrenaline. The city looked different through the glass, hostile and jagged. When they arrived, the building was a disaster zone. The front door to the suite was hanging off its hinges, the lock shattered by brute force. Inside, the world was turned upside down. Papers were scattered like fallen leaves, and the desk lamp flickered rhythmically, casting long, skeletal shadows against the walls. Amara ignored the chaos, her hands trembling as she tore at the floorboards behind the heavy oak desk. She remembered Marcus's paranoid habit of hiding things in plain sight. Her fingernails caught on the edge of a loose plank, and she pulled it back with a groan of splintering wood. There, nestled in the dust, was a small, black flash drive. "I found it," she breathed, her voice a mix of triumph and terror. "This is it, Adrian, this is insurance." But as she stood up, the air in the room suddenly grew cold. A shadow stretched across the threshold of the office, longer and darker than the ones cast by the flickering lamp. Amara didn't have to look up to recognize the smell, that sour, aggressive mix of cheap cigarettes and dirty rain that had haunted her dreams since that first night in the alley. "Looking for this, sweetheart," a voice rasped. Amara froze, the flash drive clutched so tightly in her palm it bit into her skin. The big man from the alley stood in the doorway, a jagged smile playing on his lips. Behind him, two others materialized like ghosts. They hadn't just taken Marcus, they had been waiting for the good girl to come and finish the job for them. "You really should have stayed in your cage," the man whispered, stepping into the room. "Now, give us the drive, and maybe we'll let the kid brother breathe for another hour." The warehouse on the outskirts of the shipping district was a hollow, rusted ribcage of a building that smelled of stagnant salt water, diesel, and the metallic tang of old blood. Amara was shoved through the heavy steel doors, her hands bound tightly with plastic zip ties that bit into her wrists every time she struggled. The air inside was freezing, a damp cold that seemed to seep into her marrow. Adrian was somewhere behind her, silenced by a heavy blow to the temple, but her focus was locked on the center of the vast, echoing space. There, bathed in the sickly yellow light of a single industrial lamp, sat Marcus. He was slumped in a wooden chair, his face a map of bruises and dried crimson. When he lifted his head and saw Amara, the sob that broke from his throat was the most painful thing she had ever heard. "Amara, no, you weren't supposed to come," he wheezed, his voice sounding like it was being pulled through broken glass. "Quiet," a voice hissed from the shadows. Ricardo Falcone stepped into the light, looking every bit the snake Amara remembered from the gala. He held a silver lighter, the flame dancing in his eyes as he watched her. He didn't look like a man in a hurry, he looked like a man enjoying a performance. "The brave little administrative assistant," Falcone mocked, his gaze traveling over her torn coat and the dirt under her fingernails. "You brought me my records, didn't you? The ones your brother thought he could use as a pension fund." "Let him go, Ricardo," Amara said, her voice sounding steadier than the frantic drumming of her heart. "You have what you wanted. The drive is right here. Just let him walk out of that door." "The drive is a bonus, darling," Falcone replied, his smile widening into something truly hideous. "But you are the leverage. I want to see the look on Minyi's face when he realizes that for all his power, for all his tattoos and his guns, he couldn't keep one little girl safe." The heavy steel doors at the far end of the warehouse groaned open, the sound screeching against the concrete floor. A single silhouette stood framed against the moonlight, a tall, broad-shouldered figure that moved with a slow, terrifying deliberation. Minyi walked into the warehouse alone. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was in a dark tactical jacket, his hands raised, his face a mask of such profound, lethal calm that it made the air in the room feel like it was vibrating. "Minyi, stop," Amara screamed, but the man didn't flinch. He stopped 10 feet from Falcone's men, his eyes locked on Amara with an intensity that promised both a reckoning and a salvation. He didn't look at the guns pointed at his chest. He only looked at her. "The deal was for the girl and the boy, Ricardo," Minyi said, his voice dropping to a register that felt like a physical weight on the room. "I'm here. Take me instead. You want the head of the syndicate? Here I am. Just let them go." Falcone let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Oh, I'll take you, Minyi. But first, I think I'll make you watch while I break your favorite toy." The tension in the warehouse snapped. It didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a flicker of movement from the high, darkened rafters. Minyi hadn't come alone. He had come as the commander of a shadow army. Suddenly, the windows shattered in a rain of glass, and the silence was replaced by the deafening roar of a predator finally unleashed. 1 year later, the air within the Park estate, now truly and irrevocably Amara's home, carried a weight that had nothing to do with the beautiful and dangerous lie of the past. It was a weight of permanence, of a life built with steady hands on the ashes of her old innocence. The rich, lingering scent of sandalwood and expensive whiskey no longer masked a hidden, lethal tension. Instead, it heralded a genuine sanctuary of shared history and hard-won trust. Sunday dinners had transformed from a stage for a silent, nerve-wracking performance into a vibrant celebration of a family that had been tested by fire and emerged as a single, unshakable unit. Amara sat beside Minyi at the head of the mahogany table, her right hand resting casually on the cool marble surface. The emerald-cut diamond caught the warm, golden light of the chandeliers, flashing with a brilliance that felt earned. It was no longer a prop or a polished link in a gilded cage. It was a promise sealed in a private, intimate ceremony 6 months prior, a legitimate vow that had transformed her from a pawn in a power game into a true partner in a complex kingdom. Across from her, the empty silence that once haunted these cavernous halls had been replaced by the lively conversation and genuine laughter of Marcus and Adrian Whitmore. Her brother, now working for the park interests in a legitimate capacity, looked healthier and more grounded than he had in years. The shadows under his eyes were gone, the crushing weight of his debts finally erased by the leverage Amara had pulled from the darkness of his office that terrifying night. Adrian sat nearby, the deep rift of trust that had once threatened to destroy their friendship now fully healed by the shared trauma of the rescue and the brutal honesty that had followed. There were no more secrets between them. The farce of the fake engagement had been replaced by a bond of unwavering loyalty. As Adrian laughed at a joke, Amara felt a profound sense of peace settle into her bones. She had not lost her essential warmth. She had simply traded her childish illusions of a safe world for a wisdom and strength that allowed her to command the very darkness she once feared. Throughout the meal, Amara was hyper-aware of Minyi beside her. He was still the lethal protector, the man whose focused, intense gaze could command silence in any room. But to her, he was the only real thing in a world of strategy. Minyi leaned in, his sharp jawline brushing against her temple as he whispered a sarcastic, private observation intended only for her ears. His warm breath made her skin tingle just as it had on the night of the gala, but the fear was gone, replaced by a deep, settled heat. She turned to him, seeing that while the quiet danger still lived in the depths of his eyes, it was now tempered by a light that only she had the power to provoke. He wore his tailored black suit with a relaxed but dominant posture, one arm resting behind her chair in a gesture that was now purely possessive love rather than calculated theater. "Happy," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to settle directly in her heart. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," she answered, her genuine smile reflecting a confidence that no longer needed to be performed for an audience of rivals. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into a comfortable, quiet hum, Minyi took her to the library, the room where the walls of their mutual resistance had first crumbled to dust. The fireplace had been lit, casting amber tones and flickering shadows across the tall bookshelves, creating an island of intimacy in the vast mansion. It was exactly as it had been on the night of the storm, but the tension was no longer born of repressed desire. It was born of a deep, irrevocable belonging. He handed her a small velvet box, but it didn't contain another piece of jewelry meant to project an image of wealth to the world. Inside lay an antique metal key. "It's the key to my office," he said, his voice soft and stripped of the armor he wore for the rest of the city. "No more locked doors between us, Amara. No more secrets." Tears welled in her eyes as she took the cold metal into her palm. She didn't feel like a prisoner receiving a reprieve from her jailer. She felt like a queen receiving the final seal of her kingdom. She looked up at the man who had stolen her heart while trying to save her life from the shadows of the syndicate. "I don't need it," she whispered, stepping into the solid, radiating warmth of his embrace. "I already have everything that matters." He pulled her close, his dominant posture softening as he pressed his forehead against hers in the glowing firelight. "I love you," he whispered, a confession that had become the deepest, most permanent truth of their lives. "You are the light in my darkness," she replied, her fingers tracing the tattoos on his neck. "And you are the shadow that keeps me safe." In the heart of the fortress she had once feared, Amara knew she had finally found her safest harbor. Her life was no longer the quiet, sheltered sanctuary of books and office desks she had known at 22. It was loud, complicated, and sometimes dangerously real, but it was hers to command. She was the architect of her own happily ever after, the partner to a dangerous man, and a woman who had discovered that for her, danger felt tantalizingly sweet as long as Minyi was the one standing beside her. The original contract was long forgotten, replaced by a love that was at once her greatest adventure and her most permanent home.